Right. Alyssa, are you all set? I think you all should be able to, share your screen. Excuse me. Yeah, great. All right. Our next talk is by Alyssa Freeman and Barry Jangir, uh, and they are at Middle Tennessee State University. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I am Alyssa Freeman, and I am a PhD student at Middle Tennessee State University. And this is
Hi, I'm Barry, Barry Jangir. I am a undergrad student at MTSU, and we are presenting a project today on GTAs and their self-efficacy, pedagogical discontentment, and autonomy. So if the goal is to have instructors use student-centered practices, instructors often need support through opportunities like professional development. In a K through 12 context, there are two constructs that have been theorized to lead instructors to engage in professional development. These constructs are discontentment and self-efficacy. Discontentment is identified as dissatisfaction with teaching, and then self-efficacy is confidence in teaching. However, as we mentioned, this was theorized in a K through 12 context. And when trying to apply this framework to GTAs, we thought it would be important to consider GTAs' perceptions of autonomy. Autonomy is identified as their perceptions of control in the classroom. The literature on GTAs suggests that autonomy is important to consider. However, there doesn't appear to be any studies considering the relationship between autonomy, discontentment, and self-efficacy, which is what we address in this study. We used an explanatory sequential mixed method to collect our data, which includes both quantitative and qualitative data. For our quantitative data, we sent out 50 surveys to STEM GTAs. We used that data to calculate correlation coefficients, which helped answer our first research question, are there relationships between these constructs of autonomy, self-efficacy, and discontentment? For our second research question, we were interested in trying to understand the calculated correlations. From our surveys, we broke up the self-reported GTA's autonomy and categorized them, which are represented by the arrow icons, and these icons will be present throughout our presentations. For our interviews, we wanted GTAs with different levels of perceptions of autonomy. For this presentation, we'll be focusing on the stories of Sarah and George, which are representatives of low and moderate autonomy. And then Sarah is a micro GTA and George is a Bio2 GTA. Biology GTAs tend to report levels ranging from low to mid and not high levels of autonomy, which is an interesting finding within itself. So to imagine what a high autonomy GTA would look like, we also are including Ben's story, who's a math GTA. Just as a reminder, this is our first research question, and we're going to share our data based off of this question. This is how we're presenting our findings. The icon on the top right-hand corner indicates that this data is collected from the survey. The constructs and the data are indicated by these icons in the middle. For the correlation between contentment and self-efficacy, there's a negative relationship where more confident GTAs tend to report lower dissatisfaction. In other words, more confident GTAs tend to report more satisfaction. We don't have evidence of a correlation between autonomy and self-efficacy indicated by the high p-value. For autonomy and contentment, we have a positive relationship where GTAs with lower levels of autonomy tend to report less satisfaction.
And this brings us to our second research question, which I will be sharing about, which is really trying to explore qualitatively what could explain those calculated correlation coefficients. But before we begin to dive into that qualitative data, we want to give you a little bit of an overview of how each of our participants that we'll be talking about today responded to the survey in comparison to the rest of the GTAs in our sample. So to orient you to how we're going to share that survey data, along the x-axis here are the different concepts, and the y-axis is the Likert scale. And each of those icons is to help represent the meaning of that Likert scale. So the lower numbers on the discontentment scale indicate more satisfaction or less dissatisfaction or discontentment. Low numbers on the autonomy scale indicates having more autonomy in their teaching. And low numbers on the self-efficacy scale indicates less confidence with their teaching. And here are some box and whisker plots of our survey results from all of the GTAs in our sample. They tended to generally indicate being pretty content with their teaching, moderate perceptions of autonomy, and everybody was pretty confident with their teaching. Now for Sarah, who was chosen because she was for interview because she had low perceptions of autonomy, she also indicated on the survey that she was pretty content with her teaching and had high perceptions of confidence or self-efficacy as well. And so to share our qualitative findings, we're going to go back to this figure represent with the different icons and share quotes first to kind of characterize how she was describing her perceptions of autonomy, and then to explore the relationships between autonomy and contentment, and then her contentment and self-efficacy. And we're focusing specifically on those two because those are the correlations that we had evidence of a correlation, I should say. So first, in thinking about how Sarah described her perceptions of autonomy, she said this quote, and some of the quotes are kind of long, so just focus on the highlighted portions, and I'll give you a moment. So in this quote, Sarah is describing how she doesn't feel like she has a lot of autonomy. They can make suggestions to the curriculum, but they're mostly told what to do and what to teach. And so in thinking about how she describes her autonomy and contentment, she described this quote. So here, Sarah describes how even though she doesn't feel like she has a lot of autonomy, she thinks that the curriculum is good. There's good exercises for the students. And so she expresses a sentiment of it's not like I suffer, which indicated to us that even though she doesn't have high perceptions of autonomy, she is pretty content with her teaching situation. And thinking about how she described her self-efficacy and contentment, she actually expressed a little bit of dissatisfaction, as she described in this quote. And so here, Sarah is expressing some lack of confidence and being dissatisfied with teaching some particular course concepts. And she was a microbiology GTA. And so in particular, she was specifically talking about serial dilutions and not feeling like a mathematician and not feeling fit to explain those to students and experiencing some frustration and dissatisfaction with that. For George, who was our GTA with moderate perceptions of autonomy, he also indicated that he was pretty content with his teaching, although he was a little bit more discontent compared to Sarah. And then he also had high confidence with his teaching. And here is a quote for how George was describing his perceptions of autonomy. So in this quote, George is describing how he's given guidance by a supervisor, but he also has quite a bit of freedom to do what he wants to in the classroom, as long as he stays within certain guidelines. And so thinking about how he describes his autonomy and discontentment, he said this quote. So here, George is describing how sometimes there's a lack of coordination between the lab and the lecture, which he cannot control. And so he experiences a bit of frustration with that situation. And thinking about how he described his contentment and self-efficacy, he says this quote. And so here, George is describing how now that he has a sense of confidence, he can kind of shift his focus towards gaining a sense of satisfaction from when he feels like the students are learning and feels accomplished that he has done his job as an instructor. For Ben, who was our high autonomy GTA, he also indicated that he was pretty content with his teaching, was very similar compared to George and Sarah in their descriptions of discontentment, and he also had pretty high self-efficacy as well. And just as a reminder, some of the quotes for all of the quotes for Ben are a bit longer than the quotes we've shown already. So just a reminder to focus on those highlighted portions. So in this quote, Ben is describing how he has to teach certain topics that are covered on a departmental final, but he feels like he has a lot of freedom to just teach the way that he wants to. He also contrasts his experience with his prior university, calling his current university unstructured, and that finds that he likes having that unstructured and having more freedom. And think about how he described his autonomy and discontentment. He says this quote here. And so here, Ben is describing how he kind of just falls into the habit of teaching the next concept and wants to be more proactive in the future about branching out more. In particular, since he's a math GTA, he wants to be more intentional about including the nature of math into his classroom a bit more. But he also feels a little bit constrained by his perceptions of autonomy because he wants to make sure that he's adhering to the certain objectives or that departmental final that he needs to cover. And thinking about how he described his contentment and self-efficacy, he said this quote. So here Ben describes how his interactions with students can kind of make him feel more or less confident and content with his teaching. Like sometimes he picks up a weird vibe from students and then starts to feel weird himself. But other times he feels like that barrier between him and the student breaks. He can go into what he calls a flow state, and he has a lot more confidence, which we also interpreted as having a lot more satisfaction with his teaching in that situation as well. And so to kind of summarize our findings here, for thinking about the relationship between contentment and self-efficacy, we saw from both Ben and George that student interactions could really play an important role, where George described how now that he has a sense of confidence, he can kind of shift his focus towards gaining a sense of satisfaction from his teaching. And Ben felt more or less confident and satisfied with his interactions with student interactions could influence his confidence in those interactions. And thinking about the relationship between autonomy and contentment, we saw that all GTAs mentioned particular frustrations with their autonomy constraints, but the only GTA who did identify in the interview future goals for their teaching was Ben, which could be related to his perceptions of having high autonomy in the classroom. And so to summarize and go back to our conceptual framework that we showed at the beginning, we did see evidence of a relationship between autonomy and discontentment. But what is still unclear from this work is if autonomy, discontentment, and self-efficacy lead GTAs to engage in professional development or not. And so we're actually really excited that we're in the process of trying to collect data to explore this a bit more. So maybe see us next time at BIioTAP. But with that, we would like to thank you and ask if you guys have any questions of us.
Well, I can start. I kept going back and forth with autonomy, self-efficacy, and contentment, and they're all kind of interlinked with one another and influence one another too. Do you think one is one maybe more heavily influenced than the other, or have more influence on the other pieces in the triangle?
Yeah, that's fair. Did you say you did or didn't want to try?
I'll let you take it.
I don't believe that we have data to answer that. So I want to just preface that this is from my personal hypotheses, conjectures. But I would say that I believe that autonomy is probably one of the more important pieces here. Because as we saw with Ben, could be because he had that autonomy, he was able to try and identify future goals that he had for his teaching, which other GTAs with low perceptions of autonomy may also be able to do. But having the autonomy to be able to change his teaching in the ways that he wanted to seemed to be really important to him. And so I would say that aspect, along with having some discontentment, seems to be an important drivers. Yeah.
Cool. And if I could follow up too, did you at all think about or and I'm sorry if I missed this, but is autonomy, because I feel like sometimes our graduate students here, there's like a perceived lack of it, even though they do actually have more ownership and more freedom than what they can do. But there's just like this misconception or perception that, oh, I can't do anything, even though they might be able to, or there is that freedom to do that.
Yeah, and that is a very fair point. Our surveys were all about their perceived autonomy. We did not do any exploration of what actually happens in their departments. Yeah, but that's a great point.
Awesome, thanks. We do have time for more questions, so people can chime in or throw it in the chat too, and I can read. I'm happy to read those out.
So now I'm Caleb and Alyssa, you've made me think about whether autonomy, did it tend to be directed to the curriculum, or was it at all directed toward, my students here at UT tell me that they don't have autonomy either. And when I point out to them all of the instructional decisions that they make that are not actually dictated by the curriculum, they're like, oh, I guess we do have a lot of autonomy. So I'm just wondering, like, was it more focused on curricular autonomy?
I guess in a way, yeah. There's more curricular and also kind of just like interactions with higher staff too. And like if their feedback was going to be like taken into consideration was a huge thing that was talked about too.
Yeah. That's good. Like course organization autonomy, like whether or not they have a say in how things are run, might be a third thing too. I just wonder sometimes if like we would get a lot more, we could really get people to really embrace their autonomy if they understood all of the relational autonomy they had in their classes, which is so important. I always say it's more important anyway.
Yeah, that's great, Beth. Thank you.
All right. Well, we will relieve you, Alyssa and Barry, but thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very cool stuff. Our next talk will start at 1:55. So I'm going to pop up the schedule again, but feel free to use this space however you see fit. If you see someone you haven't interacted with in a while. And I will see you in just a few minutes, 1:55 Eastern time. Thanks.